Well, there's a question. For more on this, we're joined by Dr. Sean Mulller, Senior Researcher at the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Study. Thank you very much for availing yourself this morning. Perhaps I'd just like to concentrate on the tail end of what the former president was saying, that immediately after the signing of contracts with independent power producers, load shedding then was inflicted upon South Africans. To your knowledge, at least, is there any credence to the statement?
Well, I don't think it's entirely accurate. There were some key agreements that were signed with independent power producers in 2017, and then load shedding began again in 2018 after quite serious load shedding in 2015. I think the frustration with former President Zuma is he has a habit of making these somewhat vague statements and not really joining the dots in terms of what he's actually trying to say. So he's saying that these two things happen to coincide, but what is his suggestion? If you go back to the budget in 2018 tabled at the end of President Zuma's term, at that point in time the government had committed to 122 billion rand in power purchase agreements, basically guarantees that if Eskom couldn't pay independent power producers, the government would step in and do so. So those commitments were made under President Zuma's term. So it's unclear what really he's alluding to here.
And this notion that the country's assets are being sold off, including Eskom, what should, as you say, it's not clear, but what should we read into that?
Well, what I would say is let's rather step back from this and let's look at the issues without being overly guided by the former president's statements. There are some very serious concerns about what I would call the political economy of energy and public policy in South Africa right now. And unfortunately, the public is almost being manipulated into choosing between two groups. And the one group are a group of individuals who are promoting renewable interests and also promoting the policies of foreign governments. On the other hand, we've got individuals who are associated with fossil fuel industries and potentially the interests of other foreign governments. And neither of those are really acting in the public interest. So the issue here is that, for example, when it comes to the sale of state assets, there are some big questions, for example, over the disposal of SAA. It's not necessarily about whether SAA should have been privatized or not, but, for example, how the process happened. There are concerns. I've been raising concerns about the last 5 years about a narrative that splitting up and partially privatizing Eskom is going to solve any of the problems that we have, whether on the generation or the financing side. There really have been no credible responses to that, but the one thing that Eskom has proceeded with under André at pace is the splitting up of Eskom and looking into the potential privatization of these assets. That doesn't seem to be driven by the public interest. It seems to be driven by private interests. So the bigger problem is we're not having a sensible conversation about the political economy, the vested interests that are influencing energy policy in South Africa. What's happening is that the public sees the statements from one set of interests and the statement from another set of interests and tries to figure out actually what's true and what's in the public interest. And my general view is that the claims from both sides, so President Zuma to some degree is representing one side, often referred to as the state capture faction, and there's evidence that's been tabled at the Zondo Commission on that. But on the other side, we have individuals who purport to be independent experts, and they are experts, but it's not so clear that they're independent because there are good reasons to believe they're receiving money from renewable interests and potentially foreign governments and foreign civil society organizations funded by those foreign governments. So the problem is that the public isn't really getting an accurate and objective picture of what's really going on.
Yeah, there's a whirlwind of argy-bargy going on, right? And to your point of public interest, how then does one turn down the volume and critically analyze the information? Is it as public, that knowledge?
Well, one of the things I would really like to see is I would like to see individuals, including individuals such as myself, who you get onto your show, but you don't know what my vested interests are, and you didn't ask me to declare them before I came on your show. And what I can say is I don't have any vested interests when it comes to the energy space, but many of your other commentators do. So I think one of the things, and not just in the media, but the president, for example, has been having people advising him who are being funded by groupings that are not necessarily prioritizing South Africa's public interests. So that's one of the things. And the other thing is, again, if we look at the government, who is the government using to inform its decision-making? Are the people who are being appointed, whether it's in the presidency, in the relevant ministries, at Eskom, are those individuals really pursuing the public interest, or are they pursuing objectives and narratives driven from elsewhere? It's not unfortunately, those of us who have a little bit more time to dig into this can start to try and figure out some of these things for ourselves, separate the objective facts from the subjective opinions that might be influenced. But it's very hard for members of the public to do that because they rely on yourselves, the media, and you'll do the best job you can. But unfortunately, if the experts you're relying on are misleading you, then it's a bit difficult to figure out what's going on.
What is the risk?
Well, the risk is huge. There are various estimates of the cost of the energy transition. It's going to cost trillions. And one of the particular concerns I have is that the cost, so this notion of a just transition. Everybody in the energy space is talking about just transition and how great it is. But one of the things that they keep avoiding is who's going to pay for the just transition. The first issue is who's going to pay in South Africa. And what I'm seeing right now is that actually the cost is going to be shifted towards basically the people who can't opt out of the energy system. So wealthy people who can opt out, get their solar and battery systems and so forth. Large companies, the restriction on their generation has now been lifted. So they're going to be able to opt out of high Eskom tariffs, and the general, the public and small businesses that can't do that, they're going to have to pay. So that's the kind of thing that's happening in South Africa. But globally also what we're seeing is that there's an attempt to shift the burden of paying for this just transition to address human-driven climate change, to shift that onto developing countries. When actually developed countries are the ones, so-called developed countries and so-called developing countries, the developed countries are the ones who've actually created a lot of this problem. But if you look at, for example, the United States, Canada, and the UK, they're all still producing fossil fuels. What they would rather do is fund intermediaries to kind of discourage developing countries from using our own fossil fuels and earning revenue from that. They want to keep using their fossil fuels, and in some cases, some of them are starting to restart coal-fired power stations and investing in nuclear, for instance, which they're trying to discourage us from doing. And the result is that developing countries, or middle-income countries like South Africa, if we carry on this trajectory, will pay a disproportionate amount for this necessary transition than these much wealthier countries that have contributed more to the problem. So in fact, what you get is an unjust transition at the global level and an unjust transition at the local level.
So what then to also make of the notion that this was also done in the name of climate change, whereas the continent is the least contributor or has the least footprint?
Well, clearly, the science as it stands is pretty convincing on the issue of climate change and the need to address it and the broad approach needed, which is to reduce emissions. But as I'm saying, the question is who should make the biggest cuts? Where are these measures necessary? And the truth is, on the African continent, South Africa is a bit of an outlier, it's important to say that. But nevertheless, on the African continent, the contribution of the continent is really small compared to a lot of these other countries. And it has been good to see the African Union pushing back a bit on some of these issues and saying that actually one of the issues is gas. Gas is actually an important transition fuel. Even if you want to move towards more so-called renewables, gas is actually complementary to that. But there have been efforts to block African countries, including South Africa, from investing in gas. So in some sense, that's self-defeating. It might mean that even it's so short-sighted that it might actually sabotage the transition just with this determined effort to push the costs onto these less wealthy countries. So we are seeing a little bit of pushback in international fora, but I think what's also disconcerting for me is how the local narratives have been manipulated in such a way. It's sort of like, the analogy I use is it's like when South Africa in the 1990s engaged in what's been referred to as self-imposed structural adjustment. So there were these international agencies that wanted us to, for example, reduce trade tariffs and so forth. And maybe there wasn't a lot we could do about that. But what we actually did was we went further. We said, oh no, we're going to cut tariffs even faster than you ask us to do. And that was partly manipulated through local actors. And that's also what we see happening in the energy space. So it wouldn't be so easy for this to happen if it was just foreign governments saying to South Africa, we want you to give up coal faster, we want you to pay the costs of investing in renewables more quickly. But there are local actors who are also playing this role of trying to push us in this direction, which is going to be harmful, I think, to the majority of South Africans. So it's not that there shouldn't be a transition, but equity in the transition globally and locally is really important.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing is that there's nothing just about the energy transition. South Africans or the everyday person will not benefit from this. So who does?
Well, right now, quite clearly, the vested interests, right? So you've got renewable energy companies, you've got their local proxies, which I think include a number of the experts, including some of those who appear to be advising government without declaring those interests. We have foreign governments who essentially are, particularly in the so-called Western world, who are busy exploiting their own mineral resources while stopping other countries from doing so. So there are all those actors. There are probably more that I haven't named. And I think one of the questions really is why the South African government is not pushing back more strongly against this. But again, if for example one is hopefully it's naively appointing advisors who have these conflicts of interest without asking them to declare it or without excluding them on that basis, then of course you're not going to get a good advice, and of course you're going to be misled in going into the wrong direction. A collaborator of mine and I recently made a submission on the climate change bill recently, where we suggested that a clause be included there that requires such individuals to explicitly declare their conflicts of interest and be excluded from such processes if those conflicts are simply unavoidable. You'd think that's a really basic step, but it's not happening. And I should also say, actually, it's also not happening in other policy spaces in South Africa right now. So on the one hand, we've done well to kind of emerge from this era of state capture, which really could have taken the country to a position that we would have struggled to recover from for many decades. But unfortunately, it seems like there are other vested interests that are coming into that space. And so once again, the public interest, the interests of the majority of South Africans are falling by the wayside.
Dr. Sean Mulller is a senior researcher at the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Study. Thank you.